This podcast is brought to you by Kempower, the reliable, quick, and scalable EV charging solutions for everyone and everywhere. And StarCharge, the largest EV charging manufacturer in the world, and is also a provider of residential and commercial battery storage. Hello and welcome back to the Out of Spec podcast. I'm your host, Francie, and here we talk about everything electric vehicle and electric vehicle adjacent. Thank you for plugging in with us today. I am joined by Nathan King, CEO of the Brooklyn-based startup itselectric, who provide charging access to city drivers, and they provide a curbside charging bollard that features a detachable charging cord. So really interesting offering that we can see an emphasis on the importance of this as we diversify the charging infrastructure in the US and globally. So thank you, Nathan, for joining me. How are you doing? Are you in Brooklyn? Are you calling in from headquarters?
Yes, great to meet you, and I'm really excited to be here because I'm also an Out of Spec loyal listener, and it's a great way to sort of keep up what's going on in the industry. And so this is sort of like looking into the mirror and sort of seeing, now I'm sort of on the other side of it. So very excited to be here. I am in Brooklyn. I have in my background, this is a facility called New Lab, which is in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where we've been here for a couple of years now. And there's a bunch of other, it's a shared sort of work environment, and there's a bunch of other clean tech and transportation companies here as well. So it's a great place for us to get started.
Nice. I love a good collaborative space that just feeds into the creative, hardworking energy that I'm sure you have going on over at itselectric. And thank you for listening in, of course, and for, reaching out to us. I love to highlight stories and work like yours. And I've got to say, I'm excited to speak with you because we know how much pressure there is to expand public EV charging access, but there's been a strong emphasis on DC fast charging when level 2 charging will really be the key, the big numbers that make it possible to achieve the electric vehicle numbers that are projected to come on the road in the next decade. And we're seeing that also fast charging issues have been coming up during these really intense cold weather fronts, and how level 2 charging could seriously alleviate the pressure on the public charging stations, fast charging especially. So before we dive into all of that, though, I want to know a little bit about you. Nathan, can you tell me a bit about how you came to be CEO of itselectric?
Oh, yeah, of course. I love talking about myself, but I'll keep it short. So to start, I think one of the things that's very relevant about how itselectric thinks about EV charging is kind of informed by my professional background. So I'm an architect. I still have my New York State license. I've been working in New York City for over 2 decades, mostly on fairly large projects, including hospitals and laboratories. So that kind of order of magnitude. I would say that just even kind of going back another step further, one of the reasons I got into architecture was sort of my interest and concern around climate change and issues like energy efficiency and building sustainable cities. And so that was kind of one of the things that inspired me to become an architect. And it was always sort of part of my career. I got my LEED certification. Maybe not everybody knows what that is, but it's sort of like a certification that professionals can get to sort of prove that they understand how sustainability sort of works and how it affects design. And there was sort of always an overlay around sustainability to my career. So fast forward, a few years ago, my co-founder and I were thinking about ways that we could, my co-founder Tia is also kind of, let's say a couple of decades of experience in the design and technology field. And we were thinking about ways that we could put our skills that would more immediately address some of these issues around sustainability and climate change. And like, what can we do as designers, as architects to move the needle faster? And the idea for itselectric actually came out of this sort of pandemic experience. I live in Brooklyn. I'd never owned a car while I lived in Brooklyn, for 20 years. It's very easy to get around New York City without owning a car. But when the pandemic happened, I had a 5-year-old at the time. And suddenly, taking the subway everywhere didn't seem like such a viable option. And looking into getting a car, realized that for us, we don't have a driveway like many other people. In fact, 1 million people, 1 million drivers in New York City do not have off-street parking. And for what I would have to do is I would have had to drive about a mile away to a level 2 charging station that was in a structured parking garage. I would have had to pay for the parking spot. I would have had to walk that mile to there. It's just really like, it just didn't make sense. It wouldn't have been viable. And just started thinking about it. And one day I was looking out my window and I was like, well, why can't I just put an EV charger in front of my building and connect it to my power supply, let everybody use it, and though, hey, then I could make money from the other people using the charger, and that's sort of that light bulb moment going off. And so the idea just was too sticky. It was too infectious. I managed to convince my co-founder to join, and here I am about 2.5 years later, trying to get this company spun up.
That is amazing. I love to hear of the sustainability entrepreneurship space, because I don't know, I feel like we can get a little bit jaded, like, well, what are the new ideas that can really come out and make a difference? But when you have one that's sticky like that, and then you have the motivation and team behind it, it's really cool to watch it flourish. So that's very interesting. The origin story of the idea comes from your experience, comes from being a everyday user of this kind of infrastructure and seeing what is missing here. What is the gap that I can fill? Thank you for giving me a little bit of that insight. So I think you have just briefly explained it, but can you tell me exactly what the business model is of It's Electric, what you're doing? Are you selling the chargers, the energy? Please.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll unpack it and unfold it a little bit. The basic idea around It's Electric is getting what is the easiest way to put a charger in a city where people can access it affordably, conveniently. And for us, that led to a series of thoughts about curbside charging is probably going to be the easiest way for people who don't have driveways to find in parking spaces. They don't have to drive somewhere. So we're bringing charging to where people are already parking and giving them that same sort of off-street parking EV experience, right? You plug your car in at the end of the night, and you come out in the morning and you have 100% battery, and you're not going somewhere to plug your car in and waiting there while it charges and then driving home. So we decided to focus on curbside. And then, looking at the industry, we saw what was really kind of happening, even it's still true today. Most of the curbside deployments that we see are through utility connected programs. So here in New York City, Con Edison, and you guys had a great video on the Flow EV chargers that Con Ed sponsored. These chargers are all connected directly to the utility mains in the roadway. But I knew from my experience working as an architect that process is sometimes cumbersome. It can take a long time. And also the equipment and the construction process to sort of convert the voltage in the roadway to the voltage that you would need for an EV charger requires additional equipment and capital expense. And so the question that we sort of, why can't we just connect it to where the voltage is already there, where you already have power? And that's utilizing, and this is the core of It's Electric's business model, we want to utilize that already existing spare electrical capacity that we find in city buildings. And in that way, we have a lot of flexibility about where we can go. We don't have this, we don't need to put a step-down transformer or a host connection box in the roadway. We can have a lot of flexibility, in terms of the geometry of where we can put a charger. And then the other thing that is advantageous about this, what we call a behind-the-meter model, is that we can go into neighborhoods where the electrical grid is already at capacity. And that's a big problem in cities. We're just adding more and more load to our grid. And we can't wait for the utilities to make the capital investments to increase that capacity while we wait for it at the same time that the EV transition is happening. So again, this behind the meter approach, we're just borrowing that spare capacity that building isn't using, and we pull that out to the curbside. So we skip the interconnection process. We have more availability of locations. And I'll just add one more thing. We then allow ourselves to build sort of partnerships with our host properties. And I I can talk about that a little bit more as a separate topic.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Really interesting. I know how much of having worked in the public EV charging infrastructure place myself, that utilities are just really they're working pretty hard to adapt and create a value proposition for their customers. They're always thinking about the customer too, but it is a huge investment, time, effort, money, energy, literally, to get energy where it needs to be in these neighborhoods where they should just be as much prioritized, especially if we're looking for avoiding the problems that we've seen with congestion or not enough accessibility to these EV chargers. So, I mean, I'd love to speak to you talked about this a bit, but the barriers that you see, and I know that you identify, like on your website, time, design, cost, equity, and grid. And maybe you could speak to those a little bit, especially the most surprising one that you found through your research and development in building out itselectric. I mean, there might have been some clear, this is a barrier I've experienced myself, I can research about it, but maybe what might have proven the most surprising obstacle?
Well, I think that's a good that's a good question. For me, the most surprising obstacle, and this is, I think, it might not get at exactly what you're asking, but we just don't see a lot of interest or conviction around expanding access to EV charging in urban areas. And that's partially, I think, due to social sort of conditions, right? The way that we think about EV charging in the U.S. is like, well, people have range anxiety. They have this belief that their cars provide them freedom, and they don't want to. They're worried about being stranded somewhere. And so the way that we built out EV charging in this country was really focus on that sort of intra-city problem first. But when you look at the EU and the UK, they did it very differently. And again, you guys have covered a lot of this, but there was really kind of a cities first kind of approach, or at least they thought about the cities at the same time they thought about that regional travel. And it's just a different way that we approached EV charging in this country. And I still think today that we don't see the same kind of attention around urban charging infrastructure that we see around this problem of range anxiety and making sure somebody can drive across country. It's not an either or for me. Like, I also want to be able to drive across the country when I need to. But what we sort of say, instead of range anxiety, what we see in cities is access anxiety, just where like people don't know where they can find any charger. And so that is kind of still, I would say, the biggest. It's just that level of interest in how people think about it. And I think even today, like trying to convince different stakeholders that you need to build out EV charging access is still kind of something that hasn't kind of seeped through. People still think like, oh, we're just going to switch over the gas stations to EV charging stations. But we don't quite yet understand that, like, well, it's not that simple. The utilities don't have the capacity to build thousands and thousands of DC fast charging stations in our cities. And so I think that's probably where I would put that sort of biggest surprise and biggest barrier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you did reference that there are other countries and regions in the world that have approached this differently, even perhaps sooner. And this takes me to a question that I thought I was going to ask later, but I'll bring it up now. But of course, I'm sure you take inspiration from a lot of places, but I have seen this kind of similar model implemented in European countries. And do you tend to, they have different regulations and perhaps different but similar customer behaviors, but have you taken inspiration from, or where are you taking inspiration? Have you taken it from other countries or other success stories, or maybe learned lessons from them first so that you don't have to learn it at itselectric?
Yeah, and this is a fun kind of getting into the weeds part of kind of what we think about, but you guys are out of Spec, so I'm sure your listeners might be interested. But one of the reasons that we see more success in urban charging in the EU and the UK has to do with their voltage. So the baseline voltage in the EU and the UK is like 220, right? And so that's what all of what we call our accessory utility feeds. So when you're looking at a street, you've got the main utility line that feeds the buildings, and then off that line is what we call the accessory feed that feeds the light poles and the traffic signals and things like that. So in the UK, that's all 220. So tapping into that accessory utility line and getting a level 2 charger isn't as big a deal as it would be here, where everything is 120. And now you have to figure out how to get that higher voltage to get a level 2 charger at that location and connect back out to that utility main in the roadway. And so now you're talking about kind of a different level of interconnection. And so one of the things that we sort of realized is that, well, again, the sort of the place that you can find a 220 or a 240 volt voltage is actually just in the building next to the curb. So there was sort of a little bit of a different way to think about it. I'll say one other thing that we kind of took away from the European. By the way, I should say too, the curbside charging market in Europe is very much more developed in the EU than it is here. Just in the city of London, there are about probably at this point there's about 7,000 curbside chargers just in the city of London. Across Europe, I don't always have great data on individual countries, but there's at least 40,000 curbside chargers across the EU and the UK. In the US, we have probably less than 1,000 curbside chargers across the entire country. So we're pretty far behind, and our market, I think, is about 3 times larger than the EU. So we've got a long way to go still. But we can look at the EU and the UK. We're like, wow, if they are 5 years ahead of us, that's where we need to be in this country over the next half decade. We need to get tens of thousands of chargers in the ground.
That's true. Yes, I've looked at the numbers, and it is a lot of chargers to meet a lot of EVs on the road. And I think we can take inspiration from other models in other areas and learn from them. So really interesting to hear that. And I want to speak a little bit about what your footprint is now. So how many chargers do you have out there? I know you had a pilot in Brooklyn. So what is the picture of itselectric numbers right now?
So we're still a startup, and we are very happy with the sort of the traction that we've made in the past couple of years. Our first charger went in the ground. Well, let's say our first charger began public demonstration last year in Detroit. That was sort of a prototype model. It had the detachable cable, and it had sort of our same form factor. I have one of our floor models sort of set up behind me, if you can see in the video. We've since then built 6 chargers that we've now installed. 6 of them are here in Brooklyn, and we just at the end of last year we installed our 7th charger in Detroit. So these chargers are up and running. We have an active driver list. Last I checked, I think we're around 32 drivers for these 7 chargers. It's still sort of in the demonstration phase, so it's not generating any revenue. But it does allow us to sort of test out the chargers. And as you might imagine, we sometimes have to track down bugs and solve some hardware issues. Mm-hmm. But so far, this has also been a very interesting week here in New York. It's finally snowing after 2 years and finally getting into some sub-zero some sub-freezing temperatures, not quite sub-zero. So we get to test out some cold weather charging conditions here in Brooklyn as well. And so far, the chargers are running very well. And we've had great feedback and great response from our drivers. The pilot that we started, this was around February that we did the installation. It went live in April last year. This was funded by Hyundai, Hyundai Motor Company. Mm-hmm. I think Hyundai is a willing partner with us because they see an opportunity to unlock a market right now that really no EV company is having trouble accessing. So these 1 million drivers that we have here in New York City would love to buy an Ioniq. That's actually what I drive, and I love it too. And so I think expanding access to EV charging in urban areas is something that a lot of the different OEMs are really thinking about.
Mm-hmm, definitely. I was wondering, because as a startup, of course, I'm sure you're trying to gauge interest with funding options, of course. And so interesting to hear that one is an automaker, of course. Is there any other, being in the startup world, initiatives that you're a part of, or any groups you're a part of to try to expand your work, and either whether that's getting funding or just helping promote your research and development?
We are we're pretty prolific in our different involvements. I'll tell you that the Detroit. So what we're working on now is sort of actively getting our chargers in the ground in Detroit. So we want to expand our footprint in Detroit.
Yeah, why Detroit?
Well, you know what? This is a story I tell a lot, which is interesting. When we built our prototype and when we were working with Hyundai to sort of find a location, we talked to lots of different potential stakeholders about like where we could host it. And this is a shout out to an organization in Detroit called the Detroit Smart Parking Lab. Next time if you go to the Detroit Auto Show, they always have sort of parallel events. And they gave us an opportunity to sort of host the charger there. And of course, we were interested in Detroit too for other, sort of strategic reasons. Like we like the adjacency to the big three, and there's, the rest of the automotive industry sort of circulates through, including the tier 2 providers. And so we thought it'd be great to sort of have a footprint established there, just to sort of, for political reasons, let's say. But it turns out, like, actually, Detroit and the state of Michigan are very forward-thinking about innovation, and they were willing to talk to us and work with us about a pilot. And so, at the moment, we are leveraging a grant that we received from the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, and also from DTE Energy, which is Detroit's utility. And those two grants are sort of helping us fund the deployment of those chargers. We actually hired our first full-time project manager in Detroit at the start of the year, and so we're hoping to get our goal is to get 25 chargers in before we get to the summer. So check back in on how we're doing on that, but that's what we're working towards right now.
Very cool. Very, very cool. It seems like you're, as you should when you're in this space, but taking advantage of opportunities for collaboration, for funding, for grants, whatever it is, because of course the space is pretty dependent on subsidies. I mean, it's an expensive place to be in, but also when you're getting started, to fund the research. And I'd love to talk a little bit about, it sounds like you're in the MVP stage, the most minimum viable product stage. I mean, probably not minimum at this point, but you're testing, you're getting to reach cold weather temps, which of course is really important, but a bit more about the research behind creating this value proposition for curbside charging. Like, what does the engineering look like? Do you, I guess there's a lot of questions in here that I'd love for you to address. What is the research and development process? And then when it comes to manufacturing, who manufactures your product? Where do you source, and what do you consider when sourcing your materials?
Yeah, there's so much to talk about here. And like just your question like provoked 6 different topics that each could be. So, first of all, curbside charging as a vertical in the EV charging market, I think, is something that's not quite understood in North America. And one of the reasons that we're super excited about it, we see a lot of opportunity here because we're one of the first companies to really sort of establish a presence in this market. It's just a different problem to solve than, let's say, putting a charger in a parking lot or putting a charger in a structured parking deck. There's different conditions that you have to think about. Wear and tear, right? The exposure to sort of potential vandalism, these aren't sort of in secure locations, they're just out on the street. And so we had to think really carefully about what's the best design for a piece of equipment that needs to live on the curbside? And what we quickly concluded is that your standard EV charger, pedestal mounted EV charger, wasn't going to do the trick. And you guys went over a little bit of this in Paris, the Lieb chargers that they have there. This is kind of what we built our charger around, this sort of idea of making something that's very sturdy, very easy to interface. And I think key to everything too is that it has a detachable charging cable. And that is one thing that is also a little different about us. We have this idea that we're connecting behind the meter for a curbside charger is one thing that's unique. The other thing is this fact that our EV charger doesn't have the attached cord. As far as I know, we're the only company in North America. I can't say that we've received the full UL certification, but we are basically at the end of that UL certification process, and we're going to put out a nice press release when we get all of that stuff wrapped up soon. but as far as I know, we're the only company that's this far along in the detachable cable model. And again, when I talked about all of those tens of thousands of curbside chargers in the EU and the UK, they all rely on this detachable cable model. This seems to be the way to do curbside when you're deploying it at scale. I'm gonna pause and just sort of kind of take it in a different direction, but I will say that going back to sort of the idea of my background as an architect, EV charging is a transportation problem, but we think of it here primarily as an urban design problem. What is the right thing that you need to see once you've deployed something on the curbside? And keeping it to a minimum, making it very durable, and making it actually look nice. These are things that are actually very important. And so we very early on, we partnered with an industrial design company called Billings Jackson. And they are responsible for designing what we call here in New York City, we call it our street furniture. So bus shelters and wayfinding kiosks and things like that. So we very early on knew that we had to partner up and design something that was purpose built for that sort of curbside condition.
Very, very cool. Okay, I love that. And I think considering the removable charging cord is so important, and I think pretty essential in this kind of model. Like with the public fast charging, you need a cable available all the time. But I mean, also just the fact that you're including these adjacent buildings. And I also want to talk about that a little bit. So your solution is that you're using spare capacity that from an adjacent building, an adjacent property, and then you're sharing the revenue from the charger with that building owner. How do you make that connection? And do you consider these folks, these entities, customers or partners?
Yeah, that's all great questions. Yeah, the partners for sure. And kind of also stepping back and tying it into this idea that curbside charging is a different sort of vertical. One of the things that's different about it is its potential for very high utilization. So when you put a charger in a parking lot, let's say near a shopping center or something like that, and this is in no way to throw shade on this model, this is something that we need. But it's hard to see high utilization at those locations because a lot of the times the drivers are they don't need to necessarily charge their battery at that location, especially as our batteries get larger. And so it's hard to see high utilization when you have those sort of destination charging or opportunity charging locations. And in particular around level 2 charging as well. So what's different though about curbside is because, again, we're bringing the charger to where people are already parking their vehicles. We're not expecting drivers to change their behavior. They're still kind of parking more or less where they normally park. And well, there's an EV charger there. I might as well plug in and bring my battery up. The flow chargers that we have here in New York City in Q3 last year reported a 53% utilization. That's very, very high utilization. And in the neighborhoods where where the EV adoption is a little higher, you're seeing plus 70% utilization. Wow. So the economics around what we can do and how we can structure our business model is very different than when you're imagining something like putting a charger in a public parking garage. And then because we see that high utilization potential, we're able to actually model out like, well, we can actually pay for the equipment and we can pay for the CapEx, the hard costs, the construction costs to install the charger. And in that way, there's no money coming out of our partner properties or our host properties. So we do all of that for them at no cost to them. What we say is all we need from the host property is, a couple of trips to their basement and permission. And once the charger goes live, as a way to sort of lease that panel capacity, we offer a revenue share model. Generally speaking, it's around 20%, depends on the cost of the electricity. But that's our basic business model. Like any other EV charging company, we're going to take the base utility rate, we'll add a premium on it to cover our upfront and operational costs. and we earn revenue from drivers that are paying for that public charging. The advantage for the drivers is that they don't have to invest in their own EV charger. Well, they can't because they don't have a driveway. So we sort of get that charger to them. And that in that way, sort of everybody kind of wins in this scenario.
Yeah, really, really cool, obvious value proposition in my mind. I can definitely see it. So I'm thinking of, so those are partners where you're getting the energy from, you revenue share. And so then I'm a customer. I drive up. This is my street. I love it that I can charge, just passively. So what is my experience? Do I need an app? How do I use it? And how much does it cost to charge? I mean, I guess it depends on where you are, but yeah, what would be my experience?
Yeah. So, and I'll also say that in the markets where we're sort of looking to deploy, we see regulations that make sure that an ICE vehicle isn't parking there, an internal combustion engine vehicle isn't parking there, so people aren't getting iced out. So here in New York City, you'll get a ticket if you park in front of one of those flow chargers.
And they're good with tickets out there, right?
New York City, I think initially it took them a while to realize that they could, issue citations for this. But now that they understand that, it's we see in the data that icing out has really dropped off of a cliff. It hasn't been a big impediment to utilization for our curbside chargers here. Cool. And then you also have to actively be using the charger too. So you can't just be an EV just parked in the space. You have to be plugged in and actively using the charger. And so in that way, we keep that space available to people who really need it. And let's say you encounter an itselectric charger for the first time. We have our chargers all have a QR code on them that takes you to our app. Our app is right now it's in the App Store. You can find it. And once you have the app, you can find your charger on the app and initiate the charge. You put in your credit card information. It kind of works like any other EV charging app. You put your credit card information and you hit start charge. And I'll say also about the charging cord, there's probably a few things to talk about the detachable cord, but one thing that the EU has going for that is a logistical challenge for us is when you buy an EV, you get a type 1 to type 2 charging cord that comes with the vehicle. We obviously don't have that here in the US. So we have to get our drivers a cord. And so if you're a first-time driver, there's a button on our app that will take you to basically just a short form. And then we'll basically just Uber Messenger you a charging cord, and we can get that to you within the first 24 hours or so. So basically, wherever we're running a pilot, we'll just have a closet full of these things, and we'll get you the cord that you need.
Oh, interesting. So it requires me to have the cord like I would if I were charging in my garage. I would have that cord that I would plug into my outlet or my charger.
Yes. And it's at the moment, it's not something that comes with the car, but it's something that we'll give to you. And then you sort of keep that cord, and then you've got it, while we do have this sort of initial operational challenge to get you that cord, first of all, we think that the OEMs will start to supply the charger cord with the car the same way that they do in the EU and the UK, because we're pretty convinced that this model is eventually going to succeed as far as curbside charging goes, and other kinds of public charging. I lost my train of thought here.
That's all right. I mean, if you can catch it again, but I did have
go ahead.
Another question too, because when it comes to, we spoke about regulation a little bit, and then like cost to the customer. And I was just wondering if you, in general, obviously you've done your research, but the pricing, we have the kilowatt hour pricing or the per minute pricing. Do you have, is that specific to your sites or across all of your chargers, or do you have an opinion on it? Because I think there is a little bit of a debate of actually what's fair and what is not fair. And I think it actually can change scenario to scenario.
I think it's going to be it depends. The way New York City has decided to do it is actually cost per hour, right? And they have a 2-tiered pricing system where you charge a very low rate overnight. And so it's like $1 an hour. And during the day, the rate goes up. And so that lets you basically plug in, and do an overnight charge, and you're paying $12. That's not bad to fill up a battery. During the day, though, if you don't move your car and free up the charger from, then it goes to $2.50 an hour. And so there's sort of a built-in incentive to sort of make sure that you keep that parking spot clear. And you're only using that sort of daytime charging for sort of like what you would call sort of like opportunity charging, and not for that sort of routine regular charging. And that structure makes a lot of sense in markets where the competition for parking space is intense. Los Angeles and DC, their curbside chargers sort of operate on that model as well. And there's no loitering fees or idling fees. You're just paying whether or not you're plugged in and whether your battery is full or empty. Like that. That's just sort of how they've structured that pricing model. The price per kilowatt hour, I think, makes more sense in areas where the competition for parking spot isn't as intense. And so I think we'll probably do kilowatt hour charging in Detroit as opposed to charge by the hour. Just because we think that people will not have the such intense need to make sure that parking spot gets turned over on a regular basis. But we may have to try different things. I think it kind of balances out, because you do have to have some sort of idling fee there. Otherwise, people will just sort of stay plugged in forever. And so we sort of think that if you do have a kilowatt hour pricing structure, you have to add on the idling fees, and it probably amounts to the same thing if you're doing a price per hour.
Yeah, I definitely think it's important to consider the circumstance, and to be able to research what will and won't work best is critical, and it might change based on your location. So I also want to talk about, of course, if we're talking about accessibility, the North American Charging Standard, aka what we're going to call from probably here on out is J3400. So I guess it depends. Will it depend on what your driver is driving, which cable you send them? How is that going to come into itselectric's plans in the future?
So it's already been great news for us. And I'll address kind of the recent sort of technical information report, the recent TIR from SAE about the 3400 charging standard specifically. But one of the things that even before that came out that we appreciate, and one of the advantages around the detachable cord model, is that we could be connector agnostic. So actually, this is sort of when you sign up for itselectric, this is how your charger will come in a nice little itselectric tote bag. And depending on if you're driving a Tesla or something else, we will give you a Type 2 to J1772 charger. Or if you have the NACS connector, we'll give you the Type 2 to J3400. So even today, even before we've really sort of officially adopted the J3400, I don't have to prognosticate about where the industry is moving. I don't have to worry about giving drivers adapters. If you're a Tesla driver, I'll just give you the Tesla cord. And if you're anybody else, I'll just give you the J1772. And so it sort of future-proofs us a little bit. And it's kind of a nice thing I don't have to worry about. The J3400 issuance was also really exciting for us because it explicitly described a detachable cable as part of the feature set of a J3400 charger. The old standard, it doesn't really talk about how the cable is connected, and everybody is using J1772 in the EU where things are detachable. But it was really nice to actually see it sort of spelled out explicitly in the J3400 standard. And we think that that's going to be another thing that's going to sort of push the industry into sort of like this bring your own cable or detachable cable model.
Okay, so very cool, and I love that. The more we can be agnostic, I feel like that helps with, just increasing accessibility and equity and access to these chargers. So when you're sourcing these cables, since this was really only something in, like in Europe, are you using similar manufacturers to what they're using over there, or are there American-made materials that you're able to get a hold of nowadays, or do you think that's to come?
That's definitely to come. Yeah, we're still finding these cables overseas at the moment. I will say that it's all based on the same standards. So these cables will work here for its electric chargers as well as they will for all of the detachable cable. It's not a proprietary standard. Just to be
Right.
super clear about that.
Sure. Yes, very clear. And one thing I want to touch on as well is, of course, okay, so we have your partners that are using, you're using their excess energy. You have the customers that pull up and charge. What other collaboration with other stakeholders exists, like municipalities or industry partners that you have to work with to ensure that this is seamless, EV charging experience across different locations?
Yeah, that the municipal partners is definitely a big piece of what we do, and that will be true for any company that wants to operate on the public curb. And what we talk about is how sidewalks are always city property. I mean, that's city or municipal property, and so to deploy anything on that sidewalk, you do need to have that permission from the city. You got to get a permit from the city, and it's a sidewalk permit. It's different than I also like to point out that you have to get a permit to install a charger anywhere you install it from the city. There's always going to be some level of review, but there is an extra step that you have to take when you're in the right of way, and sometimes that extra step can be very complicated, like it is here in New York City. Rightfully so, because it's a big, complicated market. But in other places, it's much easier and it's much more straightforward process. But in all cases, when we think about where we want to deploy, and what we've really been doing over the last couple of years, is we've been talking to different cities and sort of assessing where they see curbside charging on their spectrum of priorities for EV charging. And we've kind of identified the areas that we think are most excited and most enthusiastic about trying it out, and making sure that we're not trying to go into a market where this is not something that they're interested in supporting. We need to have that sort of early sort of buy-in from the cities that we're working with.
Mm-hmm. You want to go in knowing that you're not destined to fail based on the attitudes or the proactive nature or not that is existing with the municipal partners or whatever it may be. That's definitely key. And it can definitely differ across all the industries and states, cities, regions, and organizations. Do you, with your background in architecture and thinking about shared spaces as well, are there other ways that you think that electric vehicles and curbside charging or EV charging in general will influence city planning and architecture of our private and shared spaces into the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one of the things that that kind of doubles my excitement level when I kind of think about this. What we're experiencing right now in this country is just like it's not even once in a generation. It's once in a technological epoch transition where we are shifting away from how we fuel our transportation from this fossil-based economy to this electric-based economy. And it's so different. I don't think we've really kind of grasped what all of the possibilities that this is going to unlock. And so, just off of the few things that I get really excited about when we look out over the next 5 to 10 years are the capacity for the EVs, which are going to be a big load on our grid, to also become the thing that balances that load. So I'm talking, of course, bidirectional or vehicle to grid charging. At the moment, we don't see a lot of traction around curbside charging, or any traction really, for this bidirectionality. When we talk about bidirectional chargers, we're talking about the pilots that we see in Texas, where people are putting their F1, but those drivers all have their garage and driveway. So what about these 40 or 50 million vehicles in the U.S. that don't have off-street? They should be part of this bidirectional charging, and they happen to be located in areas where that sort of grid flexibility is truly needed. And so it'll have a sort of a disproportionate impact, because where we do see our grid constraints really is in these dense urban areas. The other thing I'm super excited about is an EV charger is really just again, not to denigrate my industry, but level 2 EV charging is very simple. It's just a kind of a glorified plug, and but it does have a cell connection, and it does have this sort of reliable power source. And so there's other things you can now sort of do to enhance what that EV charger is sort of capable of. And so we think, we want to also enable micromobility charging. This is a big problem that we have here in New York City with lithium ion batteries for bike delivery workers catching on fire, sometimes very tragically. And so our building departments and fire departments are looking to move that charging behavior outside, where if a battery fire does happen, it doesn't have a big of impact. And it's a relatively simple thing for us to sort of modify our charger and get a lower voltage charging port on it. And so that's something we've been thinking about, and it's not available on our current model, but again, when we look out over the next 2 or 3 years, it's definitely on our roadmap.
Yeah, that is such a good point. There's a lot of safety things to keep in mind and optimization of what we do. And I mean, it's not, I don't think always necessarily expressing doubt about the industry, but like we have not optimized everything. And that means, I think personally, instead, that's the opportunity to just be creative and figure out solutions that work and really build this industry up from the bottom, it's really cool to hear about your business model, your background, and just, It's Electric in general. I'd love to hear a little bit. I mean, you spoke a little about your next goals with lower voltage charging points, but I'd love to get out to Brooklyn. My best friend lives out there, actually. So that would be great. But do you have any next goals that both me and our audience can keep an eye on for It's Electric? I know you're still in the startup phases, which is really exciting, hard work you're doing, but what should we keep an eye out for?
So I would say in the first quarter this year, there's going to be a lot of exciting announcements. I'll say one thing that we're very focused on Detroit right now as being our first sort of pilot city that we get up and running. And so we're hoping to sort of get these as many of these chargers as we can in the ground, and we're certainly going to be making some noise around that as well. I'll say also, this is not something that's been public yet, and so we're not really sharing it until our municipal partner is ready to publicize it on their end. But we did win a major city RFP here in the Northeast that we're really excited about as well, and so some news will be coming out around that. You asked sort of where our chargers are being built. I do want to say that one of the things that I'm also excited about is announcing our UL certification, as well as our first sort of major manufacturing delivery, which will also happen early this quarter as well. So we're going to be taking delivery of about 75 chargers this quarter, and that will correspond to sort of us wrapping up our UL certification process as well. And so that's going to be a lot of noise. And we have homes for, I would say, the majority of those chargers at this point. So we're hoping to get all of those installed, before we get through, the second quarter. The other thing that I'll kind of tease out here a little bit, but nothing nothing that's been made public yet, is we have a strong interest in the rideshare community. And so we're working on pilots right now that will address the specific needs and challenges around rideshare drivers. Here in New York City, about just over 55% of rideshare drivers lack access to off-street parking. And at the same time, these drivers are being pushed into the EV economy much faster than the rest of the general population. So the state of California and the city of New York both have mandates for the transition from gas to electric by 2030. All of them have to comply. And then, the rideshare companies also have their initiatives to make this transition as well. So we're going to have some announcements around that as well before the end of the quarter, and that'll be very exciting for us as well.
Very exciting. Sounds like you have a lot coming up to, stay abreast of, which I'll make sure to do. And please reach out and let me know, but I'll keep an eye out myself. I really enjoyed speaking with you, Nathan. This is a really interesting model. It's been launched in other countries. I think we can definitely do it here and find a lot of value for your everyday drivers that need access to not just fast charging, which we know has its own issues, but level 2 accessible street curbside charging. So thank you so much for your time and effort. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Francie. This has been great. I really liked our conversation. And once again, I'm really excited to be, as a fanboy, I'm really excited to be part of it.
Thank you so much for contributing to our community. We love to build it. And of course, if anyone watching has any curiosities that they'd like to air out in the comments, please let us know. And I'll do our best to get answers from Nathan and the team. And if you have, if you're in the Brooklyn area or the Detroit area, perhaps you can seek out some of It's Electric's initial works, definitely. And I hope to see it in person one day myself. I hope you stay warm. I know it's your first snow in a while. I know everyone's trying to stay warm and just beat the really icy cold that's out there. So thank you again so much for coming on to the Out of Spec podcast. And thank you everyone for tuning in. We will see you next time on the next episode. Bye-bye.